Power is rarely subtle when a superpower decides to flex its muscles. Usually, diplomatic defeats are dressed up in the polite language of compromise or mutual understanding. But what just happened between Washington and Ottawa wasn't diplomacy, it was a public dressing down. The White House didn't just announce a policy change, they announced a submission. They used a word that leaders almost never use when talking about an ally: caved. They declared to the world that the Prime Minister of Canada didn't negotiate a deal, he surrendered to American pressure. And what followed that declaration exposed the brutal reality of North American politics right now. This isn't just a story about a tax dispute. This is a story about sovereignty, about the crushing weight of economic leverage, and what happens when a neighbor with a bigger stick decides to swing it at the exact moment you are most vulnerable. Canada blinked, and the United States made sure everyone saw it happen. 3 days ago, Donald Trump issued an ultimatum that sent shockwaves through the architecture of Canadian politics. The message was blunt. The digital services tax had to go, or trade negotiations were over. Dead. Finished. On the surface, the tax itself seemed like a standard piece of modern fiscal policy. It was a 3% levy on the massive revenues earned by tech giants from Canadian users. We are talking about companies like Amazon, Google, Meta, Uber, and Airbnb. The logic was that these corporations should pay their share in the markets where they generate profit. The first payment was scheduled for this past Monday, June 30th. Crucially, it was retroactive to 2022. That meant American companies were staring down the barrel of a collective bill totaling $2 billion. Canada had already delayed the implementation of this tax for 3 years, trying to find a multilateral solution, but patience had run out. Just 48 hours before the deadline, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne stood firm. He insisted the tax would proceed as planned. The law was the law. Then, President Trump moved. On Friday, June 27th, he took to social media and dropped the hammer. He announced that all trade negotiations with Canada were effectively terminated. He labeled the digital services tax a direct and blatant attack on America. The timing was devastatingly precise. Canada was already reeling under a regime of punishing tariffs: 50% on steel and aluminum, 25% on automobiles, blanket tariffs on nearly everything else exported outside of the existing trade agreement. Prime Minister Mark Carney had campaigned on a platform of strength. He promised Canadians that the days of rolling over were gone. He used the phrase "elbows up" to describe his approach to Washington. He argued that the old relationship based on the assumption of steadily increasing integration was over, and Canada needed to fight for its interests. But Trump's Friday ultimatum turned the digital services tax into a hard red line. Canada had less than 72 hours to decide: enforce the tax and lose the trade talks, or kill the tax and lose face. What happened next stunned political observers on both sides of the border. Late Sunday evening, mere hours before the first tax payments were due to be processed, Canada's Department of Finance issued a statement. The tax was being rescinded immediately. The official reason given was to advance broader trade negotiations with the United States. But the mechanism of the reversal was personal. Prime Minister Carney had called President Trump directly. During that Sunday night phone call, Carney informed Trump that Ottawa was canceling the tax. He proposed that trade talks resume Monday morning, with the goal of reaching a final deal by July 21st. The reversal was so sudden that it caused chaos in the corporate world. Some companies had already begun processing their payments to meet the Monday deadline. Suddenly, the Canada Revenue Agency systems couldn't accept them. Confusion spread through corporate tax departments across North America as billions of dollars in liability vanished overnight. In the brutal calculus of negotiation, Canada gave up what experts call a non-trivial card. This was a $2 billion lever, a piece of legislation with real teeth, and in exchange, they got nothing concrete. No tariff reductions, no exemptions, no signed guarantees. All they got was a return to the negotiating table, the same table they were sitting at before Trump walked away on Friday. Monday morning arrived, and the narrative was seized by the victor. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt stepped to the podium for her daily briefing. A reporter asked the inevitable question about Canada's reversal. What was the president's reaction? How did he get Carney to drop the tax? Leavitt's response was not diplomatic. It was blunt, triumphant, and deliberately provocative. "It's very simple," she said. Prime Minister Carney in Canada caved to President Trump and the United States of America. She didn't stop there. President Trump knows how to negotiate, and he knows that he is governing the best country and the best economy in this world, on this planet. She added a warning that echoed globally. Every country on the planet needs to have good trade relations with the United States. The word choice was surgical. Caved. Not compromised. Not negotiated. Not reached an understanding. Caved. Leavitt continued to drive the point home. It was a mistake for Canada to vow to implement that tax that would have hurt our tech companies here in the United States. She confirmed the sequence of events explicitly. The president made his position quite clear to the prime minister, and the prime minister called the president last night to let the president know that he would be dropping that tax. She concluded by calling it a big victory for our tech companies and our American workers here at home. In politics, there is losing, and then there is humiliation. Mark Carney might survive the policy reversal, but the real question is whether he can survive the narrative. When a foreign government publicly spikes the football in the end zone while you are still trying to explain the rules of the game, you have a problem. The White House press briefing wasn't just a statement of fact, it was a psychological operation designed to show who holds the leash. Back in Ottawa, the reaction was immediate and ferocious. This wasn't just about a tax anymore. It was about national dignity. Critics weren't asking about revenue projections. They were asking a much simpler, more brutal question. Does the Parliament of Canada still decide the laws of Canada? Or does a tweet from Donald Trump have more legal weight than a bill passed by the House of Commons? Canada is a sovereign country, with the right to make our own tax laws. Abandoning fair taxation of tech giants is unacceptable appeasement. That was Don Davies, the interim NDP leader, drawing a line in the sand. Yves-François Blanchet, leader of the Bloc Québécois, expressed deep concern, signaling that Quebec sees this as a dangerous precedent for its own autonomy. Even business leaders who had publicly supported Carney were left shaking their heads. Arlene Dickinson, a prominent entrepreneur and member of the government's own Canada-US Relations Advisory Council, tried to be diplomatic, but couldn't hide her frustration. "I understand the need for diplomacy," she posted online. "I'm still disappointed to see the DST paused just hours after standing firmly behind it." Carney had campaigned on finding a way out from under Trump's tariffs. He had already compromised on defense spending, on border security, on counter-tariffs. And now, after folding on the digital services tax, he had absolutely nothing concrete to show for it. Behind the headlines lies a complex reality about power, technology, and money. Digital services taxes emerged for a reason. Multinational tech giants generate enormous revenues in countries where they have minimal physical presence. Traditional tax systems were built for an era of factories and offices, an era that is effectively over. For decades, American tech companies have paid minimal taxes in foreign markets by shifting profits to low-tax jurisdictions. Countries around the world began implementing these taxes to fix that imbalance. For Canada, the tax represented both revenue generation and fairness. But the U.S. tech industry viewed these taxes as unfair targeting of American success, and in Donald Trump, they found a willing and aggressive champion. Kevin Hassett's comments on Fox News sent a chill far beyond North America. He made it clear that France, the UK, and other nations maintaining their own digital taxes should expect similar treatment. The message from Washington was unmistakable. American tech companies are off limits. Trump signaled he would use trade negotiations to eliminate these taxes worldwide. For smaller nations negotiating with the United States, the Canadian example became a cautionary tale. Trump demonstrated two things. He is willing to blow up trade talks over relatively minor issues, and he is willing to publicly humiliate leaders who back down. University of Ottawa professor Michael Geist, a leading expert on internet law, assessed the situation bluntly. Canada came out of this exchange looking weak by scrapping the digital services tax, he said. Now, Canada had given up what was a non-trivial card and basically used it to get back exactly where they were a week ago. The reversal fits into a broader, worrying pattern for the Prime Minister. Despite campaign rhetoric about elbows up and restructuring Canada's economy away from American dependence, Carney has made a series of concessions. He failed to retaliate on steel and aluminum tariffs. He promised stratospheric defense spending increases that critics warn will require austerity cuts to civil services. He supported border legislation responding to what critics called a manufactured fentanyl crisis. And now, he folded on the digital services tax. Each concession was framed as pragmatic negotiation, but each time, the White House claimed victory. And each time, Carney's credibility on standing up to Trump eroded further. Tech analyst Paris Marx noted that this reversal demonstrated the raw power of the tech industry on both sides of the border. Silicon Valley's relationship with Trump wasn't perfect. They took hits from his tariff wars too. But when it mattered, the president protected their bottom line. For Mark Carney, the immediate political damage is severe. He positioned himself during the election as the leader who would stand firm. He criticized the previous government for being too accommodating. He promised a new relationship based on sovereignty and economic independence. Instead, within months of taking office, the opposition smells blood. Conservatives, the NDP, and the Bloc are all attacking from different angles, but the theme is the same: weakness. From Washington's viewpoint, this was never just about revenue. It was about dominance. It was about establishing that Trump's hardball tactics work. Karoline Leavitt's triumphant tone at the Monday briefing wasn't accidental. The White House wanted the world to see what happens when you challenge American economic interests. The timing of Trump's Friday ultimatum was strategically brilliant. By announcing trade talks were over just days before the tax payment deadline, he maximized the pressure. Carney had no time to build international alliances, no time to craft a coordinated response. He had to choose between the tax and the negotiations. As talks resumed Monday morning, both sides began working toward a July 21st deadline for a comprehensive trade agreement. This deadline had already been extended once. Carney initially promised a deal by the G7 summit in mid-June. That failed. Now, as the new deadline approaches, serious questions remain about Canada's negotiating position. Carney gave up leverage without extracting concessions. Trump now knows Canada will back down when faced with an ultimatum. Canada still faces punishing tariffs across multiple sectors. The United States hasn't offered meaningful relief in exchange for the tax reversal. And Trump has a well-known pattern of making last-minute demands in trade negotiations. Political analysts are now wondering what else Carney might be forced to concede. U.S. Ambassador to Canada Pete Hoekstra has already suggested that Supply Management Canada's protected dairy and poultry sectors might need to be on the table. If Carney folded on the digital tax, will he hold firm on dairy? Or will that too be sacrificed in pursuit of a deal? At its core, this fight raised fundamental questions about Canadian sovereignty. Could Canada set its own tax policy? Or does American economic power give Washington veto authority over Canadian domestic legislation? Don Davies framed it starkly. Abandoning fair taxation of tech giants is unacceptable appeasement. But sovereignty and economic reality often clash. Canada sends roughly 75% of its exports to the United States. American tariffs have the power to devastate the Canadian economy. Carney faced the reality that sovereignty has practical limits. Some commentators argue that by capitulating to Trump's ultimatum, Carney granted the American president de facto veto power over the Canadian Parliament. If throwing a fit and storming out of negotiations was all that was needed to get Canada to unilaterally cancel legislation already passed by Parliament, what does sovereignty really mean in 2026? Others counter that this is simply the brutal reality of living next to a superpower. You can have your principles, or you can have your economy. But right now, it looks like Canada might end up with neither. And the man who promised to keep his elbows up is finding out that in a fight with a giant, elbows aren't enough.